Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to speak briefly to the legislation that is before us, the FAA reauthorization. The Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, which I chair, was instrumental in bringing this bill to the floor. Our committee has a long and proud history of bipartisan cooperation on important matters under its jurisdiction. And this extends to the bill that is before us today, the Federal Aviation Administration Reauthorization Act of 2016, which I, along with my colleagues, Senators Nelson, Ayotte, and Cantwell, introduced and we marked up in front of our committee. This legislation before us today includes the most passenger-friendly provisions, the most significant aviation safety reforms, and the most comprehensive aviation security enhancements of any FAA reauthorization in recent history. This bill helps passengers and Americans who use the national airspace for many different transportation needs. For example, since the last reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration in 2012, the use of drones has increased dramatically. According to its most recent aerospace forecast, the FAA estimates that annual sales of both commercial and hobby unmanned aircraft could be 2.5 million in 2016, a number they estimate may increase to 7 million units annually by 2020. But the FAA has an outdated legislative framework being used to shape the use of this rapidly growing technology for both hobbyists and commercial operators. This is slowing down innovation and advancements in safety. Our bill gives the FAA new authority to enforce safe drone usage. This includes efforts to make sure that drone users know and follow basic rules of the sky to avoid dangerous situations. To support job growth in the aerospace industry, our legislation reforms the process that the FAA uses for approving new aircraft designs. Our goal is to shorten the time that it takes for U.S. aerospace innovations to go from design boards to international markets while maintaining safety standards. For the general aviation community, we're also streamlining red tape and adding safety enhancements for small aircraft by including provisions from the Pilot's Bill of Rights, too. Finally, we increase authorized funding for the Airport Improvement Program, which pays for infrastructure like runways, by $400 million with existing surplus funds. This allows us to help meet pressing construction needs without raising taxes or fees on the traveling public. We developed this bill through a robust and open process that allowed every member of the Commerce Committee to help guide the content of this critical aviation legislation. Last year, the Commerce Committee held 6 hearings on topics that helped inform our legislation. At the committee markup last month, we accepted 57 amendments, 34 which were sponsored by Democrats and 23 which were sponsored by Republicans. Since debate began on the bill last week, we have successfully included an additional 19 amendments here on the floor of the United States Senate. 10 of these amendments are sponsored by Democrats and 9 by Republicans. Mr. President, this bill deserves the Senate's support, and I urge members to remember that all of the important improvements that this legislation puts in place are there for aviation security, consumer protection, American innovation, safety, and job creation. I hope that we'll be able to send this bill to the House soon. We are on a pathway that will enable us to do that. As I mentioned before, we've had a number of amendments that have been disposed of, processed here on the floor already. 19 amendments have been added to the bill since it came to the floor, in addition to the 57 that we adopted at the committee level. And I want to credit the hard work that's been done by the staffs on both sides. The Commerce Committee staff obviously been very involved on the majority side as well as on the minority side in helping to shape this as it came out of the committee and to the floor. Lots of hours put in to getting us to where we are today. But I think where we are is we have a bipartisan bill that has been broadly supported coming out of the committee, which has numerous safety enhancements in it, the most that we've seen in a decade, and a bill that is worthy of all our senators' support. Now, having said that, there are other amendments that have been filed. We had, I think, at one point, I'm not sure what the number is today, but we had 198 amendments that have been filed to the bill. and we are continuing to work with the sponsors of those amendments to try and get additional amendments adopted. We have to have cooperation, obviously, from members on both sides in order for that to happen. But we have another list of another 10 or a dozen amendments that we think could be cleared, that could be added to the legislation. But we're going to need to have members who currently have holds on that process to lift those holds. But we are on a glide path to get this bill to some final votes coming up tomorrow. And so we have today and perhaps part of tomorrow in which to process additional amendments. And so I hope that members will decide to work with us. This bill, obviously, we think has been very well vetted. As I said, it's been debated heavily both at the committee level, and we've had opportunities now to offer amendments on the floor, but there are always ways in which it can be improved. And there are a lot of amendments that are worthy amendments that members have interest in adding to this legislation, some of which are germane to the legislation, some of which are not. But obviously, once we get to cloture on the bill, only those amendments that are germane would be able to be voted on. But we would like to get other amendments processed. And so I guess what I'm saying is to members throughout the day today, if you will work with us, and for those members who are currently have holds on that process moving forward, if you would lift those, it will enable us to process a lot of amendments that senators are interested in having added to the bill. And so we will continue throughout the day to negotiate with members and hopefully have an additional list of amendments that we can adopt. And I would say again that my colleague, the ranking Democrat on the Commerce Committee, Senator Nelson, and I have worked very carefully throughout this process to make sure that it's an open process that incorporates the best ideas from both sides. And we have in front of us today a bill which I think does that. And that's the reason why I think it is very worthy of our members' support. And we had a lot of participation, as I said, too. Members of our committee on both sides had ample opportunities to get amendments considered and voted on, and 57 of which were adopted during the committee deliberations on this. So it's the product of a lot of work, and I think we are at a place where when we report this out, it's a product that we can be proud of, that we can send to the House of Representatives in hopes that they will pick it up, or if they decide to pass their own version of this legislation, meet us in conference where we can work out the differences, but get these important safety measures, these important measures that will support jobs and innovation in our economy onto the President's desk where it can be signed into law and they can be implemented and put into effect. That's where we are at the moment, and again, I thank all of our colleagues for their cooperation to date and hope that we can see more of that moving forward, because it will enable us, in my view, to continue to strengthen this bill before it gets to its ultimate passage, which I hope will be sometime later this week. We've been on it now for a couple of weeks, and it's time to, I think, to get it off the floor, get it to the House, and hopefully eventually on the President's desk. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.